I'm Jan Barris, and here work at the National Committee, along with my colleagues, several of whom are in this room, because we're all really excited about tonight's speaker. Xu Bin is someone who we at the committee know well, because he's a member of one of our flagship programs, our Public Intellectuals Program, which is a program we've been running for about 10, 12 years that identifies some of the best and the brightest and people we think have a sort of good long-range future in the community that is either a China academic or specialist of the younger generation. And it's an investment in the future of educating those who educate others about China and U.S.-China relations. And Xu Bin is part of the 5th cohort. So he's been in our program for about a year, and we're delighted to have him with us. When we interviewed him to participate in the program, he was working on a very different topic, which had to do with students. And then at our last meeting, one of the important things about the Public Intellectuals Program is that we want our scholars and our specialists to share their research and their ideas with the other people in the program. So each one of them gives a presentation on what she or he is doing. So when Xu Bin said, well, I have this book coming out and I want to talk about it, I expected it was going to be on the topic that we had interviewed him on. But instead, it's on a totally different but really interesting topic on the Wenchuan earthquake and how it affected China sort of as a whole, not just people in Sichuan, who obviously were very affected personally, but how it sort of changed thinking in China about civil society and about what you do with your own compassion and how you share that with others. So we're really delighted, and I'm very fortunate because I've heard a version of the talk he's going to give tonight a couple months ago when our group gathered in Washington. So I know, I hate to say you're all in for a treat because this is a very serious and in some ways very sad and emotional, but also very uplifting topic and research that he's done. So we're delighted he's here to talk about it. And we hope after listening to him, you will all run out 2 steps away, buy the book, and come back and have him autograph it for you. But with that, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Jane, and thank you all for coming. So it's a great pleasure for me to be here to share my thoughts on my first book, which is, all right. The title is The Politics of Compassion, the Sichuan Earthquake and Civic Engagement in China, published by Stanford University Press several months ago, August 2017. So it's fresh, it's pretty fresh. And also, one of the good things about Stanford University Press is their books are pretty affordable. And you probably heard the horror stories about academic books with $100, $150 a copy. This is not the case here. It's $26. I saw the price tag outside is $20, and you can get extra 20% off if you order through sup.org. It sounds like a pitch, but you know, it's the what authors. It is a pitch. Okay, it is a pitch. It's a good pitch. Okay, so, academic authors are supposed to do everything after you publish the book. So that's basically the story. So the book is about the Sichuan earthquake. Some of you still probably can remember that earthquake. So today I'm going to give you a snapshot of the book. You're supposed to read the book, and probably you can get my ugly autograph, you know, that kind of thing. But it's so let me just give you a little bit background of the book. So the Sichuan earthquake happened in 2008 on May 12th. So it's called May 12th earthquake as well. And usually named after the epicenter town called Wenchuan, which is county. But it hit the area, the transition area between the Chengdu Plains to the Tibetan Plateau, an area which is very prone to all kinds of disasters, particularly earthquakes and mudslides. So it was one of the major disasters in the history of the People's Republic. It was the third deadliest disaster in the history of the People's Republic, after the Great Leap Forward famine and also the Tangshan earthquake in 1976. The casualties are more than 87,000 people, and affected a population of 46 million people. So it was a huge thing. And these numbers are certainly very striking, but let me show you some pictures about the devastations and human suffering on the ground. This is a picture of the epicenter town called Yingxiu in Wenchuan County. So this is a Xuankou Zhongxue, a high school in actually middle school in Yingxiu. This is Yingxiu Primary School, which collapsed immediately after the earthquake. You can see that actually the whole building collapsed into pieces after the earthquake. And this one is particularly heart-wrenching. It was taken by Reuters, one of the journalists from Reuters. So those kids were actually suffocating to death under the rubble. It's in Xinjian Primary School in Dujiangyan. A father was grieving over his son's body, which is in Dongqi High School in Mianzhu, a town called Hanwang. So all these chaos and tragedies made the earthquake not only a natural disaster, but also a political and a social drama, which has already caught attention from all over the world back then in 2008, and still has an influence on our thinking about disasters. So I only pick one of them, one of the episodes of this drama, which is civic engagement, which is defined as activities in which participants are coordinating action to improve some aspect of a common life in society as they imagine society. So the book covers 4 episodes in the civic engagement. The first one is volunteering in the emergency period. People went to Sichuan or in their own places, help the relief and rescue effort. And the second episode is the advocacy for an unprecedented national mourning for the disaster victims, which was the first time in the history of the People's Republic of China that the state held a state funeral or mourning ritual for ordinary disaster victims. And the third episode is in the recovery period, in which people still are engaging in the all kinds of assistance programs, but the room for the civic engagement is shrinking dramatically. And the fourth episode is the activism that some of the activists have started. For example, we probably recognize the face here, Ai Weiwei and Tan Zuoren and An Xiaoming, who are prominent activists in China, who collected students' names and seeking the truth about the school collapse issue. Why did so many schools actually collapse? And why did so many students die in their own schools? So these are the 4 episodes I covered in the book. And the most important thing about this is to think about people's compassion. You probably say, well, it's not surprising because, after all disasters, we have all these kinds of activities which we can call civic engagement. And you will say, well, disasters bring out the best in humans, right? And it's kind of a natural outpouring of people's compassion and sympathy. And you're certainly not the only one who thinks in this way. And the Chinese ancient philosopher Mengzi said, everybody has 恻隐之心, which means that instinctive sympathy for other people's suffering. And also this gentleman, Adam Smith, in his 1759 classic, which is the theory of moral sentiments, says that, well, we do have this moral instinct in our intrinsic to us. And interestingly, he used a case, which is an imaginary case of a Chinese earthquake, which swallowed up the whole empire of China. And his point is that, well, even the earthquake happened so far away from Europe, from us, we still have the sympathy for those people who are suffering there, who died there. So that's actually a moral instinct for us. So that's kind of, some of you probably in humanities know that there's discussion about distant suffering and so on and so forth. That was the origin of the distant suffering and all these topics in today's discussion. But I would say, well, we need, this kind of idea need qualifications. Certainly compassion and sympathy are universal feelings and emotions and moral instincts. But sympathy and compassion are one thing, public expressions and actions that express those sympathy and compassion is another. So compassion needs social and political conditions to become public actions. And this kind of civic engagement did not happen in previous disasters in the history of the People's Republic of China. For example, in 1976, you certainly have people volunteered, but they were organized by the state, by their danwei. And also, there was no civil society, or the term civic engagement didn't exist then. And the scale of the volunteering cannot be compared to the Sichuan earthquake volunteering. After 1998, when there was a huge flood in the Yangtze River area, which was also another big disaster in history, there was basically no volunteering back then. And even in the same year, 2008, in January and February, there was a snowstorm hit the southern part of China, particularly Guangdong, and made a lot of trouble for people who went home during the Spring Festival. And there was very small-scale volunteering in some local places. So volunteering and civic engagement are not just natural outpouring of people's compassion. It needs social conditions to turn into such a big-scale social actions. And also think about the Chinese politics. We all know that there's a principle called big number, right? In other words, any activity, even it is apolitical for whatever purposes, if it involves a lot of people in this activity, and then it could turn into a very political event for the Chinese government, because it could go out of control and have some unintended consequences and so on and so forth. If you count the numbers of the number of the volunteers, they're in millions and flooded into Sichuan pretty much at the same time, and also collected donations in other places. So it became the largest collective action since the Tiananmen incident in 1989. It could make the Chinese government very nervous. And at the same time, the structural base for the civic engagement is the civil society. We all know that the authoritarian state has a very strained relationship with the civil society. So how could that happen? It's one of the questions that I ask. So in other words, this kind of a large-scale civic engagement is not something to be taken for granted. It's something to be explained. So I ask several questions in this book. The first one is, why was there such a large-scale grassroots civic engagement after the Sichuan earthquake, but not in previous disasters? And the second is, how did different types of civic citizens engage? How did they interact with the different levels and the sectors of the Chinese state? And third is, against the backdrop of human suffering after the earthquake, how did the civically engaged citizens understand and interpret the meaning of their actions, deal with the moral political dilemmas they encountered, and take or not take actions to address the suffering they witness? So these questions are intended to dialogue with the literature on civil society in China. So there being two very broad approaches. One is the New Tocquevillian normative literature on civil society. So civil society is kind of a normative idea to create an independent sphere which is different from the state and separated from the state, and civil society carries the hope of democratization or culture of democracy and so on and so forth. This is a very normative approach. And the second approach is more recent. People begin to think of civil society as a descriptive term instead of a normative term. And this approach I term as complex coexistence, which means that the scholars stress complexity, variations, and the contingencies in the civil society's relationships with the state. So this actually can be represented, this kind of a complexity can be represented in the terms they use. For example, they are all oxymorons, dependent autonomy and contingent symbiosis and a consultative authoritarianism. Actually, two of the terms were invented by Pippers. Yeah, Anthony Spires, contingent symbiosis, and Jessica Teets for consultative authoritarianism. So in the tradition of National Committee. So I follow this tradition. I agree with the complex coexistence approach, but I took a slightly different perspective, which is cultural sociology. So I switched my focus from organizational relations to actions. In other words, how people act on the ground. And at the same time, expand my scope from the formal NGOs and associations and the usual focus of our studies to very grassroots groups and very small associations, even individual volunteers, and so on and so forth. And so this is one of the things I do in this book. And the second is I focus on their action and their interpretation of the meanings of their actions and the context that shape their actions and meanings. So at the core of this approach is actually the meaning. So this is what the cultural sociology is about. It's about the meaning, how people interpret the meaning of their actions. So why meaning is important? Think about volunteering and civic engagement. It's intended to improve some aspect of the society, the public good, or the whole society as a whole. Certainly you have like high school students, you need hours of volunteering to get into college, or you volunteering put on a CV to be eligible for a job, that kind of utilizing volunteering for practical purposes. But the original meaning of volunteering and the civic engagement is about meaning to improve some aspect of a civic society. And particularly in this case of Sichuan, you have volunteers traveled all the way from other parts of China to Sichuan right after the earthquake. It is very costly. It could be very dangerous. At the time, you need to look at why they're doing this, how they interpret the meanings of their actions in that dire situation. So meaning is at the center of civic engagement. Also, if we revisit Alexis de Tocqueville, we find that Tocqueville already talked about it. Just scholars ignore the meaning in our civil society literature. This passage is very familiar to many of you. So Tocqueville says that, well, in civic associations, feelings and ideas are renewed, the heart enlarged, and the understanding developed only by the reciprocal action of men one upon another. So this is quite a famous statement of the habits of the heart, which we all know that is very famous. But in the sociology of, or at least the civil society literature on China, it's basically we all forget about a meaning. So meaning is centered to my inquiry here on the Sichuan earthquake. So this project I started literally in 2009, but before that, in 2008, I went to Sichuan as a volunteer myself, 2 months after the earthquake. And after I came back to Northwestern, back then I was a graduate student at Northwestern, I decided to do a kind of suicidal move, which is to change my dissertation topic from something else to the Sichuan earthquake. Everybody was back then was like, are you crazy? But there I was, so in the field. In 2009, I went to Sichuan to do my field work. I interviewed people who were involved in the earthquake, and also I observed their participate and observed their activities, and collected many documents and other textual materials about the earthquake. And it's been a long term. It's been 10 years. This year is the 10th anniversary of the earthquake. So the book now is very different from my dissertation. I deleted about 50% of the dissertation, and also put a lot of other materials in there, and to make something that is very different from dissertation. But I think that's something I really want to say, and not sure if I say it well, but this is something that I want to present to you. So next, I will give you sort of a chapter by chapter overview of the book. So in first substantive chapter, I try to explain why there was a huge emergence of this large-scale civic engagement. So to summarize, other things you can think of is the long-term, development of civil society in China at this moment, that it actually released its power from the civil society and so on and so forth. This is a very natural explanation. The other hand is we need to think of the situation before the earthquake. We all know that in January and February there was a snowstorm. In March there was a Tibetan uprising, which was a huge challenge to the Chinese state's legitimacy and moral image. And in April, there was an Olympic torch relay going on around the world, here in the United States, in San Francisco, I believe. So there was a clash between the pro-Tibetan activists and Chinese overseas students. So that was the moment when the Chinese state was losing face, so to speak, and its moral image was in danger. And the state is seeing that, the Beijing Olympics is around the corner. And that was the moment when the Chinese state decided to repair its moral image and to gain trust not only from the domestic people, but also from the international community. And the earthquake happened. Someone in The Economist or some magazine in England says that the earthquake saved the Olympics, which is actually pretty true, that the earthquake provided a perfect crisis. I said it's perfect crisis because that it is a crisis, but it's not a very political crisis. It gave the state an opportunity to unite the people in China together to fight against the nature. And at the same time to show a human face to this outside world. See, we are nice people, we are helping each other, and we are people of solidarity, and we are good people. So it's a good opportunity for the state to show compassion and to show a human face and show its open attitude toward the foreign media, toward the civil society organizations. So that was the moment, and it was the pressure from the situation on the Chinese state. And the Chinese state decided to move toward more open attitude. Some of you, I see from the media, you probably remember that in 2008, that it's very, it's a temporary open opportunity for foreign media journalists to even follow the military, in the disaster zone. That was the moment. So the state decided to open to the civil society as well. So that's why there was two kinds of factors. One is situational factor, because the earthquake and the situation. Second is long-term civil society development that actually contribute to the emergence of the civic engagement. And then I also look at who are actually the people on the ground. So among my interviewees, two types are quite familiar, so-called civil society actors. One is formal NGOs, and the other is 公益团体, civic groups, very small, sort of informal, but their 公益 is for more civic, for civic values, for public good and those groups. But other groups are very, trivial. For example, car owners club, and also Supergirl fan club. Supergirl is the equivalent to American Idol, so you can imagine what they're talking about, what they do daily. So buy lots of records of their star, and flew to the cities where the concerts were held, and all these things. And also I have cosmetics clubs. The woman discussed about, I don't know what Jingyu is, still don't know what Jingyu is. So the talking about cosmetics and so on. And the Marathoners Club and the Mountaineers Club and so on and so forth. All these small groups are usually ignored by civil society scholars in China, but we have those groups in the literature of general civil society. For example, Robert Putnam's bowling group, right, which is at the local level. The decline of the civil society is represented in the decline of all these groups, the local groups. So there's no reason for us not to include those groups in our study of Chinese civil society. And also, I listen to their feelings and ideas, how they interpret the meanings of their actions. So among my interviewees, I have someone who claimed that he is contemporary Lei Feng. He is, as you can imagine, this person is from Mao's home province, Hunan, and someone who is following him to making a documentary of this hero. So this is the person, and I also have someone who claimed that I'm doing this to build the Chinese civil society, 公民社会, so with a very explicit purpose to construct the 公民社会, the civil society. But I also have a vast majority of the volunteers who believe that this is a moment that the Chinese people united together and to fight against the nature, to show that we are the people who deserve the respect from the rest of the world. It shows the solidarity to the world. And also have someone who uses Buddhist and Christian values and to interpret their volunteering. And also have someone, the most interesting case is the individualistic interpretation of the meaning of their volunteering. So this one, I call him Xiaoli, who is a young businessman who just started his company in Chengdu. So he spent all his money, which is 140,000 yuan on donation, and collected more donation and delivered all the materials to the disaster zone. So Xiaoli was a member of the so-called 80后generation, after 80s generation. The public image of this generation is basically they are the me-centered people, right? It's always about me, me, me. Yeah, it's actually true. And he never uses, well, it's actually true in his case. He never uses the phrase like we Chinese people or we Chinese nation. That actually is not in his interview, in his words. He always said, well, I do this because it made me happy. Particularly when I feel I'm so respected by the people in the disaster zone, I feel so satisfied. So it's about me. And I reminded him that, well, you spend a lot of money on that. You lose a lot of money on that. And he said, quote, I quote here, yes, I spent at around 100,000 yuan, but I collected relief materials worth more than 300,000. From an economic perspective, I made a fortune. Although the materials did not end up in my hands, it was more than 100% profit. I believe any businessman who can make that kind of a profit will be considered successful. It's me. Because successful me is doing something that it actually satisfies myself. So it's about me-centered interpretation of the disaster volunteering. And the second chapter is about the national mourning. So just real quick, the national mourning, some of you probably take it for granted because, after all kinds of disasters, people around the world usually have mourning rituals. But it was the first time in Chinese history that the state actually had a mourning for ordinary citizens. And previous state funerals were all for leaders, such as Mao's funeral in 1976 and Hu Yaobang's funeral in 1989. Certainly the two rituals led to different outcomes. And this time, the difference between the Sichuan earthquake mourning and the state funerals in the past is about for whom the bell tolls. It's about the object, the sacred object of the ritual. This time is the ordinary citizens. And it shows that every individual's lives deserve the respect from the state, from the rest of the society. This kind of idea sounds familiar to us, right? In all kinds of commemorations, we read everyone's names, and we show that everybody, whoever this person is, deserves our respect from deserves our commemoration and our mourning. And not surprisingly, this idea was cherished by some liberal intellectuals and liberal media in China. They advocated for that. And the state accepted for situational reasons, which I mentioned earlier, that is the moral image. And also, it's not a very costly move for the state. It's just one small gesture, but it was extremely successful. This was the only time I heard, and I remember in recent Chinese history, that the Chinese state was praised by people across the political spectrum. That was the only time. So the idea is basically about for whom the bell tolls. And I also talked to the people on the ground to look at how they interpret the meanings of the commemoration. So we see the same multivocal meaning in those rituals. You have message cards with China, stay strong China, this kind of message on the message cards. But also you have message cards for, actually it's the cover of my book, is Mother for the Children who died in the earthquake. It's more familial emotional expression. And also, you have those people who are in small groups, believe that this is a way to get away from the state, to do our own things in the square, not to following the Danwei's official memorial, official commemoration. Just went to the public space and so on and so forth. So again, it's a very diverse expressions of meanings. And the third chapter covers the recovery period. So the things are changing, and the biggest move is two biggest moves for the state. One is the state actually formed alliance with big corporations. The local governments wanted money to recover the economy, so they welcomed big corporations, and particularly real estate developers for obvious reasons. You need to rebuild all these things, and the second move is the state's priority has been shifted from the saving people's lives and to recover the economy and also to maintain the social stability. And we all know that in political vocabulary in China, maintain social stability means that suppressing the, some of the voices. On this issue, the school collapse became the hot button issue after the earthquake in the recovery period. This picture was taken by a journalist, and it's a Fuxing Erxia, I believe, in the Mianzhu County. So I assume everybody knows what happened, right? So the children died in their schools, and how many students died? The official number is 5,335 students, which was suspected to be lower than the actual number of student casualties. But even this number was beyond our imagination. Think about this number again, 5,335 students, which is a huge number in a single earthquake. In minutes, even in seconds, so many students died. And people began to ask, what happened? Why did so many schools collapse? And what's behind this? So if you want to know the reasons, we actually don't know. But there's a very good investigative report by Caijing, which is one of the most popular magazines in China. I think it's in June 2008 about the causes. So it's all about funding. So the funding was appropriated. There was corruption involved in the contracting process. But appropriation is more complex than we thought, because the money was appropriated for the purpose of giving teachers more salaries. So you have two things. One is to build strong buildings. Second is to give teachers more salaries. And the teachers there were underpaid. So that was the complexity at the local level. And also it involved Zhou Yongkang and the so-called Sichuan gang and so on and so forth. That's another story, which we can go on forever. But the point here is that when the school collapse issue became the biggest problem for the social stability, and the state began to suppress those protests and petitions. And in addition, the state began to rebuild some of the places, reshape the topography of the disaster sites, and build some memorials. This is one of the memorials, the Beichuan earthquake memorial. The site was interestingly sad, I would say. It was right on the site of a Beichuan high school. If you follow the news of the Sichuan earthquake, Beichuan High School was the most tragic high school in the whole earthquake. And how many students died in a single school? No one knows for sure. But my estimate is more than 1,000 students. And they died in the earthquake in a single school. This is what it looked like after the earthquake, Beichuan High School. And then the rubble was removed or covered by the grassy mound. And if you walked into the museum, you have a panel like this. The Chinese reads here, the safest place is the school. And with children with a smiling face and brand new track and field. And this is kind of a very upbeat image of the earthquake. And in addition, you have heroic images of us as the states respond to that. And also, as we all know that Weiwei's story and Tanzhuoren's story now becomes famous, I assume the audience here is very familiar, so I don't spend much time on that. So one thing I want to highlight is Ai Weiwei and Tan Zhuoren link the issue of school clubs to people's rights to know and to be known. To know the fact, to be known if the person is dead, to be known by outside, and the causes of the death is to be known by outside. So that's one of the things I want to highlight. I'll skip this. But you probably want to ask that what do people, not just Ai Weiwei or Tan Zhuoren, those activists who are actually pioneering the activism, the ordinary people who went to Sichuan, think about this. This is actually a big part of my book. So I asked people, and I first asked the former NGOs and the staff members and the former NGOs. The message is clear. Don't think about it or don't talk about it. You can think about it, but don't talk about it. And the direction from the staff, from the NGO director to their employees is basically like, don't make trouble, don't increase pressure, and to be a good assistant to the government if you want to stay in the disaster zone. Some of the NGOs even signed contracts or agreements with the local government to say like, we won't do anything that hurt the social stability, and we will contribute to the reconstruction, recovery of the community, and so on and so forth. And what about those people who are ordinary volunteers who are not involved in any of the NGOs or marginally involved in NGOs? So this is one interview who actually went to the Fuxing town where I showed a picture of the parents' petition. And he took the pictures of parents' petitions and protests right after the earthquake. So I asked him, did you actually upload the images to online forums? He said no. I asked why, and he said that, well, I didn't present all the truth because the two words truth, 真实, are not something that everyone can accept, so I can only present them in a limited and appropriate way. And I asked him that, well, you certainly have some emotional stress and so on and so forth, and not talking about the issue. And he said, yes, that's certainly the case. I had nightmares, sometimes feel guilty, but we have a group, so we have group chats and kind of a therapy-like method, and to talk away those negative feelings. So that's it. That's the end of the story. And also we have this person again who compare the Sichuan earthquake to. I didn't cover that. So this person, let me give you a little background. Who actually went to Tiananmen in 1989, one of the student protesters, and he compared Tiananmen with Sichuan earthquake and say everything is like similar and there's a harmonious atmosphere after the incident and so on and so forth. So he was a very kind person. He donated a lot of money and much time and accommodating outside volunteers. He's a businessman in Chengdu, owns a hotel and nightclub. Unfortunately, he didn't invite me to his nightclub, so we had an interview in a hotel. But he said, I asked him about the school clubs issue, and he said, well, so he was like this. Well, this issue is like, so this is what he said. So now China is at the so-called primary stage of socialism or capitalism without welfare, the most primitive and brutal way. In this situation, everyone makes some money for themselves. In other words, if one could get through inspection, nobody would strengthen the construction. Even the affected people think in that way. So it is quite normal that in order to save money and to make more money, people do such things at this stage of development in China. In other words, it's more like a normalization of the evil, normalization of the ugly reality. This is an ugly reality. I chose to accept it. That's it. So whether you can cross the boundary to address the causes of the suffering, no, it's not my business. And remind you that if you own a nightclub in China, you need to have a really good guanxi with the public security. So that's one of the reasons. So to conclude, so I have several take-home messages for you, which I conclude in several phrases. One is the politics of compassion, which means that civic engagement is shaped by political context. And the people's expression of compassion is kind of social and political action is always shaped by the civil society's relations with the authoritarian state in the case of China. And this relations is not just the organizational structural relations, but also is about meaning, about cultural relations, and understanding of what should be a good society is about. And also how the civil society actors frame their actions. For example, if you want to set up a center for disabled people in China, you can choose two ways to talk about your center. One is, I want to do 公益, right? Public welfare. I want to help the society and to do social service is fine. And the second way is to say, like, I want to construct a civil society, 公民社会, and then good luck. Because 公民社会 is one of the 7 don'ts, right? And one of the 敏感, sensitive political terms in China. So your relationship with the state sometimes depends on how you use the words and the vocabularies and the phrase and to talk about meaning of your actions. And the second phrase is moral ecology, which I borrow from Richard Madison, who is a veteran China expert. Many of you know him. So he basically said that the vocabularies and ideas and the cultural terms people use to describe civil society are shaped by their context, not necessarily the same as our classical understanding of civil society. For example, foreign media always focus on 艾薇薇 and 谭卓人, and for international NGOs and local NGOs and organizations, while do not think about or do not pay much attention to ordinary citizens' understanding of their meanings. As I have shown in this book, that their meanings are very diverse, from nationalism to religion to individualism and to civil society, certainly, and Maoism. So you have a huge range of meanings people are using to describe their civic engagement. And the third phrase I use to conclude my book is compassion with apathy. This might be the most controversial one. I argued that the biggest irony of the Sichuan earthquake civic engagement is the coexistence of compassion and apathy. On the one hand, we see people are showing compassion through their actions and words. At the same time, we find people that are not reluctant to cross the boundary to address the causes of the compassion, causes of the suffering. So here we have a classical ethical and political dilemma here, which is not just about China, which is everywhere. Jane Addams' type of volunteering, which addresses causes of people's suffering, and to do something to address the social and political causes. Or you can stay in the comfort zone of warm volunteering to be a nice person and to help people and to reduce their suffering without addressing the causes of the suffering. And it's something that we always face on our daily basis. But the Sichuan earthquake is a very particular context, in which there's lots of emotions going on, which highlight the many moral issues like life and death and people suffering, seeing so many children died in the earthquake. Think about you're a volunteer. You went to Sichuan and you taught at a tent school and taught a summer school, which is good. You're a nice person, but not very far from your tent school, there's a pile of rubble, which is a school building, and still 100-something students are buried under the rubble forever. And you pass this rubble every day and to your tent school to teach the children. Do you feel anything? Of course. What do you want to do? I don't know. So this is why people avoid talking about politics, and in their action, they show some degree of apathy. So this is a coexistence of the compassion and apathy. I'm not blaming the individuals. Actually, I'm trying to say that the political context shapes the coexistence of apathy and compassion. And because in a repressive context, your cost of saying aloud or talking about issues and which cause people suffering is very high. The higher the cost of talking aloud, talking about the issues, the more dangerous you are, and the less likely you're going to speak out about a problem. And the less likely you're talking about a problem, and the the result is that you are not talking about the problem at all. There was a silence. This is what we call the spirit of silence, the context, and then people's behavior, which are reinforcing each other. So this is why I call this the coexistence of compassion and apathy. And I skipped the tocqueville part. So this is actually a pretty important part. It's not just the ritualistic dedication to those children. I started this book when my daughter was 7 years old. And many of the children in Sichuan are at her age. So this is basically a book for my daughter, or for the children at my daughter's age. And I was a volunteer. So this coexistence of compassion and apathy is still in my heart. And I feel the same ethical and political dilemma still now. Certainly I have the privilege of being a writer, being an academic. I can say something. I can talk about the causes of the issue. I can describe it. But many people do not have this opportunity, or still in a context which actually, prevent them from talking about the issue. So this book is dedicated to those children who died in the Sichuan earthquake, and also to those parents who are still suffering from their loss. Thank you very much.
We're going to open it up for questions. I'm sure you all have a lot, but I'd just like to ask you to begin. So you've talked about the fact that you went as a volunteer. Had you ever done any volunteering before that?
Nope.
And so what caused you to do it? And what did your wife and daughter say, or did they go with you?
I think my case is very similar for most volunteers after the Sichuan earthquake. They have never done anything that's so spontaneous for them. Probably they participated in those 学习雷锋 activities in their schools, learning from the activities, if you can call that volunteering, but it was organized by the school and by the state.
That.
Yeah, we don't count that. Okay. So if you don't count that, many people like me went to Sichuan for the first time, flew all the way from places so far from Sichuan. It was very costly and could be dangerous, and it was certainly a very tough situation there. You don't, you have no running water and things like that. So you can imagine that not taking a shower for 7 days, 8 days in that situation. And also, the most important thing is the emotional toll on you. So that was both my motivation when I saw the pictures I show in the beginning of the presentation, and also the outcome of my volunteering, that is the emotional outcome. As for my daughter was back then very, very young, so she didn't know anything about it. So my wife certainly supported. It was a very brief volunteering, not very heroic, and just teaching kids in tent school, which I described that then. So that was my experience in Dujiangyan. Yes.
All right, Bill, start and introduce yourself, please.
I'm Bill Armbruster, retired journalist. What's your estimate of the actual number of children who died? You said the official estimate is 5,335, but from what I've read, I had the impression that it was many times that official.
I actually don't have an estimate for that because I don't have data. So I'm a social scientist. Without data, I don't do that kind of estimate. But Ai Weiwei and Tan Zuoren have their figures, which are similar, surprisingly, right? Similar to the 5,335. Right. Yeah. And but they all say that, well, because we don't have the access to the schools. Their volunteers were expelled by the local governments and even sometimes interrogated, and so they don't have access to some of the most tragic places. And their data is incomplete. So right now, the only number we can use is the official number, which is already very, very surprising and very tragic number now. Yeah.
I'm Sewell Chan, I'm a journalist. Could you tell us about whether what's the history of disaster response in China? was there any organized disaster response during the late imperial and Republican periods?
Wow, that's a big question. We have historian, maybe disaster history is now a booming subfield in contemporary, in modern Chinese history, particularly in late Qing period, and also in the Mingguo, the nationalist, the Republic of China period. So from what I read, there are some studies about the foreign associations' involvement in disaster relief. So like a Huayang Yizhenghui, I don't know how to translate that, but anyway. So the foreign associations and also some of the associations at the local level, like a Shanghui, Chamber of Commerce, and also like Tangshan, such as like Guangdong Huiguan, and those involvement in the disaster response. And if you want to know the sincere journalist, you probably should contact scholars at the Renmin University in China. They have disaster history, and also a few English books just published in recent 1 or 2 years are very good about disaster, and also involves some of the cultural meanings, such as the mandate of heaven and the state's ritualistic performance of sympathy toward people and blame themselves for the disasters which actually cause problems for the people. I have an article in China Quarterly which is about the state part, which was the part I deleted from a dissertation, and not in the book, but published in the China Quarterly, about the state's moral performance. So I compare the post-Tangshan performance to post-Sichuan performance. The significant change is basically the scene change. If we see performance as something in a setting, so setting changes. Because back then in Tangshan, the devastation and human suffering are not allowed to be reported. So people don't know what actually was going on in Tangshan until rumors, are spread. But now in Sichuan, you have all these very unusual reporting activities going on. Foreign media and the liberal media and the state media, Xinhua News, some of the pictures are taken by Xinhua News, and created a very emotive scene for the state performance. This is why Wen Jiabao's Tears are so successful back then. It was not about Wen Jiabao, it's about the background, the scene, which was unusual in the disaster response. Yeah. You want to take the questions?
And I work in the investment sector. So I remember when Jiabao went to one of the school and wrote this, 多难兴邦 on the blackboard, which means, disasters lead to the prosperity of
That's
state.
true.
So I wonder, how different groups are receptive of this, notion. And I mean, to me, it's all this disaster is a huge loss to family and individual, and how and that leads to the state's prosperity. How do we reconcile this individualism and
That's
the
a very
state?
good question. Yeah, 多难兴邦 on the blackboard, and later that piece of the blackboard was cut off and put in the museum. So that was the story of this 多难兴邦 thing. The reception are pretty expected. So for those dissidents and liberal intellectuals, they will think of this is just nonsense. There's no causal relationship between the adversities and then the revival of the nation, right? There's no causal relationship. So that's the reception from the liberal intellectuals, dissidents. Most people don't think much about this phrase, I would say. They take it for granted because they think this is just a phrase to encourage people that to step out of this disaster to build a better future. And I'm writing another article now. It's about resilience. So resilience is not just the Chinese thing. It's a kind of a modernity, linear, progressive view of the past and the future. The past has been so horrible, and then we conquer the past, overcome the past, and to build a future. And materially, we can, the disaster has helped us, wiped out everything. It's a clear ground. in mouse terms, we have a blank sheet, so we can draw the most beautiful pictures. That kind of mentality was represented in some of the slogans after the Sichuan earthquake, particularly from the government discourses, like 四川的明天会更美好 because of the disaster. So it's like we have the resilience and to build our better future. And we have lots of money invested, and we have corporations, we have government spending, and so on and so forth. But what about the past suffering? No one mentions that. So in the museum I mentioned, there's the safest place at school. That museum, if you walk in there, it's all this kind of narrative pattern that the past has been overcome, and the government's response to the disaster was effective. And then we have a better future, better school buildings, better highways, and we have tourist spots. Ironically, Yingshu now becomes, one of the tourist spots. I have a friend who, Christian Sorachi, wrote another book on Sichuan earthquake, which is called Shaken Authority, and he has very wonderful descriptions about, those places becoming, tourist spots, and the suffering were covered. I myself has another paper on it as well. So this kind of a resilience idea is everywhere, and the reception varies. Yes.
Rebecca Farrell, I teach at NYU history. I wondered if you could talk a little bit, it might help open up this question that Sewell asked as well, about the class basis of volunteering. Obviously you have disposable income, you now have time to get away from your job. These are all sort of markers of middle class or a certain kind of class basis. And it's part of the self-fashioning of a middle class, right? Even the story you tell, there's a heroicism to having to, endure these bad conditions, and then you can go back to your nice running water and your good sit-down toilet and and your nice bathroom and all the rest, right, in wherever. So that I wonder if you could, and that's what would make it really different from Tangshan, or really different from a malware disaster, for example, because you don't have that kind of class fashioning, you don't have that kind of class formation, you don't have that kind of, but that's what makes it somewhat similar to some of the discourses on disaster stuff in the Republican period, where you had also the beginnings of a middle class or an urban petty bourgeoisie, or whatever you want to call it, right? So I wonder if you can talk about it in terms of a social structural change.
Good.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's a very good question. So a class certainly matters. The Mingguo and late Qing period, certainly you have this upper middle class people, right? And with the foreigners. And also among my interviewees, a significant number of them are middle class people, certainly, not surprising. But also among my interviewees, I thought about this problem when I was doing interview, but many volunteers are college students who have no money, or college graduates who just started their jobs. Some of them quit their jobs, and also have someone like who's basically a primary school teacher who has not a lot of money. It's more like very underpaid in those places. So they travel not by air, but by train. Not by air-conditioned train, but those 绿皮火车, the green ones without air conditioning, and with the 坐票, they're sitting for. I have a group of volunteers who are actually the main characters in my story. I still have contact. Most of them travel by trains and sitting or standing in a train for 14 to 18 hours from all over the country, and then met in front of the Red Cross, and the Red Cross actually didn't call them back, so they decided to organize themselves into a random group, which is a volunteer group. And these people, I don't know, later probably become middle class, but at the time, some of them were jobless, Some of them had very low paid jobs, but I don't see a very strong correlation between class and volunteering.
Even as an imaginary.
Even as an imaginary.
Really?
Yeah. So, for example, this guy claimed he's a contemporary Lei Feng. He was jobless. He was a local peasant in Hunan. So he biked from Hunan to Sichuan. So that's why his deeds are so heroic that the local Hunan people sent a team and to make a documentary about it. So that's the.
I'm fascinated by that question. And
Chris,
answer.
introduce
Oh,
yourself.
sorry, I'm Chris Kwok. I work at the EEOC in
Mhm.
New York.
EEOC,
The
something.
Equal Employment Opportunity Commission.
Okay.
The Chinese American. Even though it's not about class, it seems the end of the starvation mentality in China, and that's the marker. Like
Mhm.
now that people are no longer starving, or a generation or two past that era,
Mhm.
now they have space within their minds to give something, and that was decisively different than before. Like in the history of modern China,
Okay.
or the Chinese Communist sort of rule. That was interesting to watch on television.
Okay.
To see that for the first time.
Yeah, but individually, those people do not have the memory of the Great Leap Forward famine. Many of them are younger. The oldest one I interview are 55 at the time, so you can see, didn't actually experience in the most tragic. And many of them were like a 30-something, born after the Great Leap Forward famine. And as a collective memory, I can say that the Great Leap Forward famine was forgotten in media. It was rephrased, euphemized as the 3 years of a natural disaster. So many of the things are not really played out in the public discourses, although you can find the causal relationship between the policy adjustment, between the famine and policy adjustment at the local level in places like Anhui Fengyang. Yang Dali has a book on that. But it was basically at the local level, while in the public discourses, the starvations back then were way to the very deep background, which did not have much effect on the people's actions today. Yes, Angela.
Angela Zito, I teach at NYU. I'm an anthropologist mostly. I was curious, because you said meaning is at the center of this. So from your field work and even from yourself, what were some of the expressions of the meaning?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
Expressions of the meaning.
Oh,
What
okay.
did people tell you? Did you ever ask or hear them talking about it?
I do ask why you're doing this, or how do you view your...
May not
Yeah,
feel
and
that.
also observe their,
Exactly.
for example, the apathy thing. So I participated in the groups, and so sometimes I try to do a sort of a experiment to raise the issue of the school clubs, and people became a little bit uncomfortable,
Sure.
and then switch topic.
Did
In
you
their
ask them why they came?
Yeah,
And-
I did.
And their answer?
And their answers varied in those which I already presented. And also, some of the meanings are not really the answers to my questions in their narratives. So people would say, like, I encountered, there's one person who is a Buddhist and who actually bumped into a person who lost his family and his friends in the earthquake zone. And then he still continued to do volunteering for others. So she said that, the person I interviewed, she said that I was deeply moved because now in today's society, there's moral degradation and things like that. So these are the parts in the narratives which are not direct answers to my questions, but show the meaning and the patterns of the meanings in the interviews. So my interviews are not like, I have a list of questions, It's not like that. So it's basically to listen to their stories, and sometimes I intervene in the, their narrative flow and trying to find the places where they do not say the word meaning or whatever reason, but to figure out how they understand and how they interpreted their meanings. Yeah.
Have school.
Maybe that gentleman, yeah, because you have already asked it before. Yeah.
So I'm sitting here.
Introduce yourself.
I'm John Lowen. I'm with the National Committee, and the, depending on how one thinks about it, the son or grandson of Holocaust survivors. So I'm accustomed to the notion of a generation not talking about very difficult things and segmenting their mind. And yet, so I'm trying to figure out kind of what happens with that over time. And I guess I've kind of seen it in an American context, but I'm wondering about, I mean, what you describe as kind of compassion with apathy, or what I think of as cognitive dissonance. How does that play out? What are the longer term implications for China if people cannot address, I guess publicly, the causes of the suffering?
That's $1 million question.
Yeah. So what are your
yeah.
thoughts, and what's the literature?
Well, the things, since it's been 10 years, so the things I've been observing is, one thing is the booming volunteering. So volunteering now is becoming a fashion, particularly among younger generations. So it's 公益 or something like that, or all kinds of very fancy. I actually don't know some of the things, but it's becoming fashion. So it's hard to make a judgment on that, to say like people are more cold-hearted. That's unfair. So we can see this compassion and public expressions are expressed in public discourses and even in their actions. So this is a good thing, which is to improve some of the. And if you look at the number of the donation, so it's increasing very quickly in China. At the same time, it seems like there's a war between the compassion, the warm, do nice things compassion, and the angrier activism or kind of compassion to address the causes of the suffering. There's a war. You keep hitting on that war when you try to cross the boundary between the two kinds of compassion. And this war, in my opinion, and it's set by the political context, is not just the cognitive dissonance. So if we look at cognitive dissonance, yeah, certainly it is there, but it's more like a universal argument across all the contexts. This is psychology is about. And in sociology or political science or social scientists, we would say like, in addition to the universal psychological mechanism, we do have the outside, the political and cultural context shaping people's cognitive dissonance, leaning toward a certain direction. That was the case of China today. For the long-term implication, I would say, although it's more like a general observation of today's Chinese society, it seems like very prosperous. It's booming everywhere. You have a very diverse society. But underneath this diversity and multiple and multivocal expressions, you have this dead silence. Dead silence on some of the critical issues. Particularly, some of you probably have this feeling if you're from China. When you're talking to the people back still in China, you have this frustration, right? When you talk about some of the issues in China, they were like, why you are so negative about China? And why are you, because you are in America or something? So choose not to say anything about those things. And also at the same time, they're nice people. They're doing very good things for the public good and the donation, and we shouldn't call them the cold-hearted people. So I don't know, maybe it's the what's the word, segregated or whatever you want to say, like compartmentalization of the Chinese society at the bottom of the moral feelings, I would say. Yeah.
Can I say that I think that problem also goes beyond China, that the inability of the Chinese people to freely sort of work out its historical
Right.
memory
That's
leads
true.
to an international misunderstanding
That's
of China
true.
on the world stage. And as a Chinese American who goes back and
Right.
forth, I see the understandings, particularly in America, in terms of how we come at the historical understanding politically in a way
Mhm.
that's often problematic, but is often not subject to criticism.
Mhm.
It's very difficult to see that as it becomes critically important for us to understand China in World War II, for example.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
I'm Margot Landman with the National Committee. I think you mentioned very quickly in your talk, and I know you write about it in the book, but I think John's question also leads to this, or your response to it. Should we see the civic engagement, however limited it might be by our standards, as part of a developing culture of democracy, or is it something else entirely?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. Well, maybe. The only answer I have is maybe, because we do have an ideal type of what culture of democracy looks like. And this ideal type is from Tocqueville, from Robert Putnam, from East European countries, and so on and so forth.
When you say we, you mean Americans or Chinese?
We Americans, although I don't usually. No, anyway.
That's why I wanted to make
but
sure.
anyway, since we are trying
Right.
to make
Okay.
solidarity among. So anyway, so this ideal type, if we use this ideal type to look at the reality, that might be a little bit problematic. So I'm not making a prediction where the civic engagement is leading towards, or cultural democracy or democratization. I don't know. I'm agnostic about it. So I'm describing this situation now, which is more complex than this ideal type of culture of democracy. And also sociologically, it's again back to Richard Masson's term, which is moral ecology, in the context where the local contextual factors could shape people's vocabulary and their expressions of meaning. Whether you say this is a symptom or it's a problem or it's a good thing, it depends on where you stand.
Yeah, I have
Introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Joan Calvin. I'm from the Schwartzman Scholars Program. My question is really whether it's really a kind of cognitive dissonance or it's just people protecting themselves because they know in the authoritarian
Right.
system that they're working in, civil activism,
Right.
or especially if the government has clearly communicated it's not okay to talk about all the school children who died and attribute it to responsibility or a failing of the government or of anything else.
Good.
You know, that there's a self-preservation quality that is ingrained by parents to children and over, 50, 60 years of communist authoritarianism about, what's okay to it's compartmentalizing for survival in a way, that in this context, they can give back and be good moral people by volunteering
Yep.
and providing public welfare, at the same time as knowing very well they're not going to be crossing a line because, they'll get in trouble or they'll, it will lead to no good for them
Mhm.
in their life, political career, or anything else. So I think there is a kind of pragmatic
Yeah, I agree.
survival mechanism or conditioning that it's just based on the reality
Yeah.
of the system.
I think it's both. So the fear of being into trouble, getting into trouble, and also the the political situation, you don't want to talk about it, and this kind of pragmatic attitude, and also the apathy are reinforcing each other. The longer you're in that context, this is actually the spirit of silence is about. You know the danger, and this is a politically sensitive topic. You don't want to talk about it, and so you have the spirit of silence. Later, you lose the ability to talk about it. So it's reinforcing each other. And then you tend to rationalize your choice, not to say, I fear of suppression. As you are normalize the ugly reality. Well, this is normal. Or, well, this is something that we cannot do. What I cannot do else. And so it's reinforcing each other. So it's not like cognitive dissonance or the emotional response can be separated from that kind of practical concern. It's both. It's reinforcing each other. This is a wide spirit of it.
Smaller family circles.
Yes.
Really in the the more
Yeah.
private environments.
Right.
There is a sense of outrage
Yeah.
or discussion, or that it surfaces, but just not publicly. I don't
Yeah.
know.
Well, even in small, in local settings like my conversations with the volunteers, not recorded interviews, so it's in my participant observations, people are less likely to talk about even among the volunteers who went to Sichuan, saw the things, and saw the school collapse issue, and particularly for those people. Because it is one thing to talk about it online, it is another to talk about it when you actually experience the horrible things and you can do nothing about it. The emotional stress on you is greater than those people who are distant observers of the suffering.
So you're saying that people who were involved don't talk about it among themselves?
Yes.
That's interesting.
Mm-hmm. Many, not all
Right,
of them,
right,
of course. Yeah.
Last question, okay?
So I'm Curly. I teach at John Jay College. So it seems to me one of your major findings is that people, volunteers, deliberately avoid politicizing the disaster, especially the human aspect of the natural disaster. So I imagine nobody will say, I want regime change because of this,
of course
right?
not, yeah.
But just because people avoid politicization does not necessarily mean they don't invoke the notion of rights. I imagine,
Right.
Let me know if this is what you find in your research. Did anyone say, I'm a parent, I deserve to know this? In other words, I have rights. Whether it's civil or political, it doesn't matter. In other words, during your interviews, did you hear people invoking the notion of rights a lot, or this barely happened?
Not many. Only people who identify themselves as the liberal intellectual 自由派, like, think they have affinity with people like Ran Mingfei and Ai Weiwei would say, I have the rights. And the rights, the term 权利, actually is not in the narratives of the interviews or the conversations, which I don't know, maybe it's the, I don't know,
But your interviews were mostly with the volunteers and people outside. If you'd interviewed the parents or the people directly
Certainly.
involved, then
They
you
would.
would
I
have
interviewed
heard
one parent. I didn't put it in the book because he was detained for several times, and if I say something about him, maybe But certainly,
Right.
the parents certainly talk about rights. You are the person who are actually suffering,
Right.
instead of you are just distant observer or observers. The bystanders who are talking about the issue are quite different. And when people, a few of them saw Ai Weiwei and Ai Xiaoming's documentaries, they will make comments online to say we deserve the rights to know the truth, right? But among the volunteers, not many. Yeah.
Unfortunately, our time has come to an end, but you can learn more about what Xubin found by buying the book. And I know he'll be here a little bit longer so that he can autograph them for those of you who do. But please join me in thanking him for...
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Not just for the talk that he's given us tonight, but for the very important work he's done in writing a book like this and about such an important subject. So thank you.
Thank you, Jane.